Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Jeffrey James Higgins. He is a celebrity, at least in the Washington, D.C. area. He has fought the Taliban. He has chased terrorists across 5 continents. He has received the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Heroism. And the Drug Enforcement Administration, better known as DEA, Award of Valor. He's written many books, actually best-selling books. And one of them is The Havana Syndrome. He also owns the Elaine's Literary Salon in Alexandria, Virginia. And so with us today is a major figure of our times. And today we are going to discuss what is narco-terrorism and why it still matters. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. Looking forward to our discussion.
Well, it's a pleasure speaking with you. I've heard quite a lot about you from mutual friends, and all of them have been unfailingly complimentary. So I'm glad we are finally sitting face to face in your fantastic restaurant in Alexandria.
Oh, thank you. And I love your podcast. So keep up the good work. These are really important conversations to have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's crack on with the subject at hand. You've fought terrorism, and your life was defined by 9/11. You were one of the first people to get there after the Twin Towers collapsed. And my question to you is not so much about what is terrorism, but what is narco-terrorism?
So narco-terrorism is really the nexus between terrorism and illicit narcotics trafficking. And you're right, standing on the bodies of thousands of people in New York definitely defined what I wanted to do for a career. I was doing mostly transnational criminal group investigations at that point, going after illicit narcotics traffickers and violent hit crews in New York City. And after that, I refocused my entire career on going after terrorism in all of its iterations. So terrorism is politically motivated violence against non-combatants, and illicit narco trafficking can be any kind of illicit drugs in the United States. So these two come together and they support each other across the world. There's a symbiotic relationship between illicit traffickers and terrorists. And now it seems sort of common sense to say that, but like when I first went to Afghanistan in 2004, I was meeting with top members of our intelligence community who were saying there was no connection between drugs and terrorism, and it just seems so absurd, right? Because as the assistant country attaché in Afghanistan, almost all of our cases had both a terrorism and a drug nexus.
Well, Afghanistan was growing poppy, record amounts of poppy for a long time. And the proceeds from poppy production, I'm sure, still fund the Taliban. I'm sure a part of it. Of course, the Taliban, some say, has reduced poppy cultivation. It's not as much as under the warlords or under even the previous government. But still, I must, guess. I'm certain that they wouldn't let go of such a lucrative revenue source.
No, of course not. I mean, Afghanistan was one of the world's leading poppy producers. And from that, they were creating opium, they were creating morphine, they were creating heroin. Afghanistan was responsible at that time for probably 90% of the world's heroin. And since then, of course, fentanyl has really taken over. It's a cheaper and more potent variant of it. Mm-hmm. Fentanyl is roughly 50 times as strong as heroin. And it's easier to make in a lot of ways because you don't have to grow it. So that's taken over, which has caused part of the problem.
And how's fentanyl linked to terrorism?
So any illicit narcotics give a revenue stream to terrorist groups. So we see roughly, it used to be about 42%. I believe it's closer to 50% now of all terrorist groups, like designated foreign terrorist organizations or specially designated global terrorist organizations, are linked to some kind of narcotic sales. Even organized crime, moving outside of terrorism, is roughly 50% of groups, like in Europe, for example, of organized criminal groups are linked to terrorism. It's just the
'Ndrangheta in Calabria, which has displaced Cosa Nostra, more popularly known as the Mafia, in Sicily, is a classic example. They control the cocaine trade into Europe. That's the source of their power and that's the source of their purse.
Yeah, it just makes sense, right? If you're in a legal organization, you can't necessarily open storefronts under your own name, and there's money laundering through other legitimate businesses. But the profit percentage that you get from illegal drug sales is huge. You know, a kilo of heroin that you can buy for maybe $2,500 in Afghanistan, for example, you can sell that for up to 90,000 in New York City. So the profit margins are huge, and so that's why many terrorist groups have engaged in illicit narcotics trafficking, or they've engaged in a relationship with narcotics traffickers where they protect the traffickers and the traffickers work, you know, hand in glove with them, both to corrupt local officials and for trade routes. So there's four major types of narcoterrorism. There's a classic narcoterrorism that everyone thinks of with like the Pablo Escobars. It's the group that's committing, you know, acts of political terrorism against judges and attorneys and police.
As we saw in Mexico recently.
Yeah, it's happening every day in Mexico. It's a way for them to further their drug proceeds. It's a way to grow a drug business. And then there's ideologically driven people like the Taliban who are using drug trafficking as a way to further their ideological goals. And those could be, you know, theopolitical or whatever ideology the particular group is pursuing. Then you have a much smaller group of people that are both drug traffickers and terrorists. And I did the first narco-terrorism case under 21 USC 960A, which was the narco-terrorism law that we helped get passed with the information that intelligence we were gathering in Afghanistan. And that was a Khan Mohammed, a man who was both a drug trafficker and also a member of the Taliban. And then you have the broader one, the symbiotic relationship between these two groups, where they just work together. You know, whether it's bringing people through the mountains, whether it's using human trafficking or weapons acquisition to support each other. And then, of course, you have state-sponsored terrorism, which we see quite a bit of in state-sponsored narco-terrorism, where states are understanding that this is a covert way that they can fund their illicit activities across the world.
Pakistan is engaging in quite a lot of narco-terrorism in India, in particular in the state of Punjab. And I'm sure there are other states doing the same. Of course, there are allegations against China as well in the context of the US.
I mean, China, there are different levels of narco-terrorism. You could argue they are the biggest narco-terrorist state because they are funding the majority of the world's fentanyl. And it's not just the fentanyl, it's analogs. So it's the synthetic drugs that are similar in chemical composition to fentanyl around the world. And it's in China's interest to do this. You know, we spend probably $80 billion a year in counter drug efforts in this country. And if their fentanyl importation into the US is driving up those numbers, it's doing a lot of things. It's hurting our GDP. It's destroying the country from within. You know, China has a pretty open strategy of disintegration warfare and unrestricted warfare against the United States, where they're looking to undermine the institutions in the United States. The disintegration warfare is having the country disintegrate from within. So
that's what Russians are trying.
Yeah, it's an old KGB method, and it's been picked up by terror groups. It's been picked up by Iran. It's been picked up by China, and it works, right? It's trying to get into a country and cause dissension however you can, turn people against each other, groups against each other. It's a lot of identity politics, and it's a way the unrestricted warfare goes beyond that. That's saying like the classic warfare of two armies going head to head is we've evolved beyond that, or I'd say devolved.
Let me push back a little bit, Jeffrey. In a way, it's always been like this. The British Empire grew opium in India and then exported opium to China. And so you could say the original narco-terrorists were the Brits. And this meant famine in India, so starvation and death, starvation and death for the brown people. And it meant addiction and undermining of this Chinese society or let's say, addiction for the yellow people. So it's an old story, and the Opium Wars were what led to the humiliation, or rather inaugurated the century of humiliation for China. And in a way, China has never forgotten that. So it's nothing new.
Sure, it's no, it's been going on forever. It's
Yeah.
across all cultures. I mean, it's a way of it's a way of an old way of warfare. But when it's as part of a national strategy that you're looking at unrestricted warfare, you're looking at cyber attacks. You're looking at financial attacks. You're looking at ways to undermine infrastructure.
Mhm.
It goes beyond the narco-terrorism, which is what
I
China
mean,
is
which is
doing.
what the British did as well. They had a
Sure.
comprehensive strategy, and that is why they were able to conquer societies much bigger than theirs. So they had a very astute intelligence and diplomatic operations combined with very targeted military strikes.
Yes, that is true. That is true. However, it really did evolve after that. Like even in the American Revolution, right? It was looking at warfare in a different way. Instead of two armies going at each other,
Yeah,
it was looking at special operations
yeah.
and looking at guerrilla type warfare. And so it has changed quite a bit.
Yes, of
But
course.
but using narcotics and the money from the narcotics as a tool of warfare is happening right now, and China's certainly doing that against us. I mean, this is a collectivist communist society that's opposed to us philosophically. An individualistic, driven with human natural rights is a completely different type of society,
Mhm.
and they are in no way motivated to. Even though they pretend to, we have bilateral agreements, we have working groups between our law enforcement and intelligence in China, but even with all that, if they wanted to stop the incredible flow of fentanyl and other opioids into the United States, they could do it, or mostly do it.
Mhm.
But there's no reason for them to do it. If it's undermining us economically, if it's hurting us culturally, if it's killing a lot of Americans, and it's causing us a problem, why would they stop? Especially if they're the ones benefiting from the money. And most of it is coming from China. It's coming through Central and South America. It's coming through third countries.
Mhm.
It's coming through the mail. It's coming in a lot of different ways,
Yeah,
but it's driven by China.
but the Trump administration has claimed that since they've come to power, China has cut back on fentanyl. Would you agree with the claims of the administration?
I would agree that China does some things to appear to be complying,
Mhm.
but I believe in a country like China, they have more of an ability to clamp down on like illicit drug exportation than they say they do. I just don't think they're motivated to stop it. So yes, they'll do things like they'll classify certain analogs of fentanyl as
Mhm.
illegal, and they're slow to do it. But the majority of fentanyl is still coming out of China, right? And so they're not stopping it. So yes, they'll do things to pretend,
Mhm.
and some of it, by the way, is hurting China, right? The actual drug use within China hurts them too. So
Mhm.
there is some motivation on their end, at least, to curtail their domestic abuse of these drugs.
All right. We've talked about narcoterrorism and the various types of narcoterrorism. Tell us how narcoterrorism compares to traditional terrorism.
Well, there's a couple different components to it. So that we talked a little bit about the use of the drugs themselves. So as opposed to just blowing things up, now you have drugs that are undermining a society in a very insidious way.
Mhm.
You're
So the opium dens are preferable to sacking the summer palace of Beijing.
Yeah, I mean it has a longer tail, right? It has a
Yeah.
longer term effect. It can muffle like a society's ability to do a lot of things. It's bad. Like large spread drug use, especially with opioids, is really bad for society. So that's a piece of it. But also when you're introducing like narcotics trafficking, as opposed to traditional, like if we're just going after ISIS, traditional terrorism, they're here to shoot people, blow things up. We can use the military. We have different tools that we can use to bring to bear, and it's more clear cut in what we're doing overseas as opposed to narco trafficking, which involves a number of like let's call them civilian criminal organizations, so transnational criminal organizations that are involved in human trafficking and smuggling and weapons acquisition, in funding, in the actual crime. So it's more of like an amorphous group that's a like within a terror group you'll have multiple cells and they can be some semi-autonomous, all working for a similar goal. And it's like that with the narco-terrorist groups, except you're bringing in more groups that maybe only come together for one thing. Maybe they come together to move drugs for one specific purpose, but other than that, they're doing their own thing. So it makes it more difficult. And
It's more diffuse.
yeah, very much so. But also, it's the difference between military and civilian, right? So you see this with like the narco boats that we're using the military and activating the Pentagon, and there are places where we're directly using the military. But most of narco-terrorism is done with law enforcement. So when you're doing that, now you're talking about bringing criminal cases as opposed to military cases, right? So as opposed to blowing something up, you're actually bringing people into a civilian court, and now you have all the rules that we have to work under, and that causes a myriad of problems because you're taking a U.S. legal standard and you're trying to apply it to, let's say, Afghanistan, to a conflict zone where there's austere environments where it's very difficult. There's not the freedom of movement. It's very difficult. You don't have foreign police or intelligence that are helping in the same way that they would in like a Western country. So if you're trying to collect evidence at that same level, it's incredibly difficult, and also to bring it up to a standard that will work in a federal court. Now, I'm a big fan of like judicial prosecutions when we can do them, because as opposed to military tribunals, like I like the transparency of being able to show evidence and do things publicly. But it's not always feasible. And so when you're going after a terror group, like a narco-terrorism group, you're going after both the terrorists and the drug traffickers that are working with them. Occasionally it's the same person, but generally it's different groups of people that are working together.
So it differs from traditional terrorism, as in it's not as unidimensional. It's not one organization dedicated to violent acts. It is spread across civilian actors and terrorist groups. So it's more diffuse. And also, it is different because it has a long tail effect. Immediately, it'll be less spectacular than blowing up, say, the Twin Towers, but it could hollow out an entire community, as in West Virginia, for instance, not far from where we sit right now. Would that be fair summary of what you're trying to say?
Absolutely. I mean, that is part of it, but there are also narco-terrorist groups that are committing direct acts of terrorism themselves, right? They are blowing things up. You see this a lot in Central and South America. They're committing the classic acts of terrorism, the hijacking, assassinations, decapitations,
so that is
murders.
the similarity.
Yes.
So there are differences as well as similarities. So they continue many of the acts of traditional terrorism, as they did after the head of this big cartel was killed in Mexico, but they also do the other stuff as we've just discussed.
Exactly.
Brilliant. So now let me move on to another question, which is, how does narco-terrorism affect national security? You've outlined some of this in your previous answers, but paint us a sharper picture. And how are narco-terrorism challenges different from traditional terrorism?
So I think we touched on the differences a little bit, and it's mostly in the enforcement, but it's also because it bleeds into the drug use as well. So you get into issues that are maybe a little stickier, like with public perception. If you have a ISIS group that's in New York looking to blow something up, there's pretty much a unified understanding of what that is. If you're talking about the group that's selling fentanyl for that ISIS group, you'll have a little more dissension domestically about what they're doing. What was the first part of the question?
The first part of the question was, how does narco-terrorism affect national security?
So, I mean, I think it was in 2022, we hit the peak. We had over, I think it was close to 110,000 Americans die from overdoses. Last year, it was somewhere around 73,000.
So the number is coming down.
It's been coming down for the last 3 years.
So the Chinese are doing something.
Well, that these are broadly the numbers of deaths are coming down, but we also, our enforcement has gone up. Our border security has gone up. We're blowing up narco-terrorist boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. So we're doing other things. So you can't just point to China doing a few things that look good. But I'm sure it has some effect. Whatever China does that helps curtail the flow of drugs from a source country, that is going to help. But we're doing a lot of things domestically with law enforcement and the military that have been affecting that. So we've been seeing the numbers come down, but they're still much higher than they were 5-6 years ago. So there was this huge spike in overdose deaths. So if you want to talk about a national security issue, that's a huge one. When you have tens of thousands of Americans dying, that's a
and in poor
issue.
health, both physical and mental. and
Sure.
productivity takes a dive.
Right.
And so, on the whole, then national security is impaired because the nation is not as healthy and not as productive as it could be.
Yeah, 100%. You're also seeing these groups that are working together. So if you're talking about narco terrorists, whether they're coming from the Middle East or from China or from Central South America, when they're coming across the border with drugs, sometimes they're bringing terrorists with them. Sometimes they're bringing designated terrorists into the country at the same time. Some of the criminal groups, like we haven't really even talked about the gangs, but Trend
Let's talk about
Raga,
them. Let's talk about them.
MS-13. I
Mm.
mean, these are now designated, right?
Mhm.
Just in the last year, these were designated as terrorist organizations by the Trump administration. But these are incredibly violent transnational groups that have destabilized countries, like in the past, like El Salvador was completely destabilized because of MS-13. We have MS-13.
Mexico is destabilized.
Yeah.
You cannot. I have visited Mexico a few times. I have taught there, and at certain times of the evening, a lot of places are no-go areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's parts of Puerto Rico where the police won't go at certain times of day, So I mean, these can really destabilize countries. In the U.S., these are violent, really violent groups. Like I mean, I think it's really interesting. We live in this time when we have all this technology because it's an incredibly wealthy country. People drive nice cars. Everyone has air conditioning and indoor plumbing. We have all these things. We become so comfortable, which is good. And I think it'll only get better with AI, right? Things keep comfortable. But people,
Well,
when you
better for some, but some people may lose their jobs too.
oh yeah,
We
no,
don't know what's coming.
there'll be whole industries
Yeah,
that are displaced for sure,
yeah.
right? But the cost of everything, like as technology does, will bring it down.
Hmm.
But as life gets easier, I think it's really easy for people, especially in this country, especially people who are wealthy, to forget about this objective good and evil that exists in the world, and that much of the world doesn't live like this. These groups, these like MS-13 groups, do not follow any of the traditional morality that we do in this United States.
Hmm.
So you have like MS-13, for example, they were headquartered in like Los Angeles, but you have groups in Chicago and New York and Boston, and we're in the DC area. We had MS-13 here, murdering people like to get into the gang, terrorizing like the illegal community, for example, would be terrorized by MS-13. They're just vicious. They're decapitating people. These are violent criminal groups that are only able to exist because of the money that they're making from drugs.
So, if we were to look at it from a philosophical standpoint, what is a state? A state fundamentally is an entity that monopolizes the use of violence
Yes.
in a society. And if a state is unable to monopolize violence, then you could have, in effect, a country like Italy, even in Europe, where you had the Cosa Nostra in Sicily, the mafia, popularly known as mafia, and of course popularized by the Godfather movies. And now you have the Ndrangheta, and that undermines law enforcement, that undermines the judiciary, that undermines the very idea of rule of law. And that also adds to transaction costs in society because everyone is paying extortion money or something or another, or simply is unwilling to sign contracts because there is no certainty of contracts or safety of life. And you get a highly inefficient backward economy over time. You don't get it on day one, but over time, this is what you get in societies that are criminal.
Yeah, 100%. So the number one illicit economy in the US is drugs. And when you create these black markets, you not only keep money away from, say, the tax base, which as a libertarian doesn't bother me that much, but you're creating a shadow economy. And as you mentioned, there's a short-term benefit to that because there's still money exchanging hands, there's still an economy going. But when it's outside of the traditional economy, it actually slowly bleeds the economy because the money has to be hidden. It goes outside the country. It just doesn't work. And you mentioned a state having the exclusive use of force, which is one of the components. But a nation state also has like borders, and a nation state also has the rule of law. The nation state often has some common cultures that have some cohesion for the people within it. So when you're bringing in narco terrorists, they really can pull at all these threads to unravel a society.
They can unravel the tapestry built over a long period of time.
Yeah, very easily, and the more insidious things too are this erosion of trust that people have in the government and in the institutions.
Mm.
And when you see things happening openly in front of you, and the government's inability to like step in to enforce, say, the rule of law, when you
Mm.
have people being decapitated in your neighborhood, that makes people withdraw from like I guess a collective belief
Mm.
in a society.
So let me ask you a difficult question. A number of my friends who have retired from the CIA are adamant about the fact that drugs is more of a demand side problem. They say the war on drugs has never worked. The war on drugs has been a distraction from their real job because they have to focus on the great game that the Russians are engaging in or the Chinese are engaging in, great power rivalries, or for that matter, the rise of organizations like Islamic State, which have a powerful ideology that could really destabilize an entire region, or for that matter, the nuclear proliferation. I could go on, but you
Mhm.
understand their reasoning. Their reasoning is that if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority, and and they say that perhaps fentanyl trafficking from China and Mexico is a public health crisis rather than a national security crisis, and the very idea of a war on terror, or sorry, war on drugs, and indeed even the war on terror, is an unwise idea. What do you say to them?
So it's possible to enforce the laws against murder
Mhm.
and rape at the same time, right? So yes, you're right. If everything is a priority, there are things at certain times that are more of a priority, and
Yeah.
everything you just mentioned is a problem, and they are all national security threats for
Mhm.
sure. But that doesn't mean that like narco-terrorism is not a problem, right? So it's not something that should be ignored because we have another threat that's
Mm.
serious. We can do more than one thing at once. We have a national security apparatus that can focus on numerous things at once. I do agree
Mhm.
that a lot of the war on drugs is totally ineffectual.
Mm.
I mean, it is a demand problem. Ultimately, if everyone just stopped doing drugs, we wouldn't have the drug problem, right?
Mhm.
But that's not human nature. It's never been human nature, and it's
Mhm.
never going to go away. So the question becomes, and I mentioned I was libertarian, right?
Mhm.
I believe in letting people make their own mistakes, but
Mhm.
it is bad for society. I can tell you now, if I walk home from work, I can't walk home without smelling marijuana, like
It's a
literally.
problem. I mean, I'll be honest with you. Walking around Georgetown or Roslyn or coming out of the National Press Club, which is on 14th Street, and walking past the White House, past um, the monuments, you can smell marijuana even in the heart of the nation's capital. So yes, I don't like the smell, and many people I know don't like the smell, and that is a problem.
So beyond the smell, right? If
Mhm.
you have heroin addicts lying in the street, like look at San Francisco, right?
Yes, yeah,
they've destroyed that
yeah.
city with just rampant drug use, with the lack of enforcement, with not putting people away for violent crimes,
Mm.
just letting people out, this revolving door of justice that they have there. That's a problem. So
Hmm.
the libertarian answer might be let people do drugs,
Yeah.
and if they ruin their lives, fine. But if they're doing it in public, if they're infringing on other people's rights, at that point you can incarcerate them. So I think the more you liberalize the laws, the anti drug laws, the more you have to enforce when they're infringing on other people's
Yeah.
rights. So those two things can work together. And there's one more point: the
Mm.
fentanyl is a different animal.
Mhm.
And because while I could agree that like maybe you should legalize some of these drugs that are recreational, and you can compare like the problems with marijuana to like alcohol abuse, and
Mm.
I'm very susceptible to hearing these arguments.
Mhm.
Uh, Carfentanil was developed as a weapon of mass destruction. It's 100 times more potent than fentanyl.
Mm.
1 grain of carfentanil on your skin will kill you. You cannot legalize the weapons that are that powerful in
Mm.
this country. So where I don't really care about marijuana, I do care about fentanyl. I do care about
Got it.
carfentanil. I also care about people bringing it in at a
Mm.
toxicity level that is guaranteed to kill people, and
Mm.
especially when it's coming from organizations that want to kill people. I
Mm.
have Taliban members on tape talking about whether it's with opium or or with bullets. They're going to kill the infidels, you know? So that's an act of war, right? They're actively trying to kill American citizens. So I'll agree with your CIA colleagues that yes,
No, no, they are not colleagues. Let's be clear. They are friends. You know,
okay.
I don't work for the CIA.
So your CIA friends,
Yeah,
I'll
or
agree.
retired CIA friends. My co-author, of course, Glenn Carl, is a legend who understands geopolitics very deeply, and from whom I've learned a lot. And his point is that, you know, you have to be more focused. Organizations have to be more focused, and states as well. And let's take a step back, and let me take a broader philosophical point of view. Generally, in societies, when addiction rates go up, it's a sign of a cultural malaise. It could be super high inequality, wherein the rich become too indolent and the poor become too desperate. Um, it could be a loss of faith in the future. It could be a complete lack of jobs and prospects. Because 19th century China, which experienced the most violence of any major state, at least, it was a terrible century for the Chinese. That was because the political and the social and the economic order was collapsing. People turned to opium dens because they were simply lost.
No, I 100% agree. I think when people lose agency, when they
Yeah,
don't feel like they have the ability to improve their lives,
yeah.
they look for artificial ways to stimulate their happiness centers and try to create these feelings of euphoria that they can't get normally. You could argue that this in recent years we've had this sort of cultural shift where
Yeah.
people have been told their lack of success is not their fault and that they don't have the ability because of their race or station or whatever it is to improve their lot, and that's the exact wrong thing to tell
So
people.
learned helplessness, in a
Yes.
way, is contributing to the problem. So in a way, uh, we partly agree that this is certainly, there's the demand side to work on, because you have to reinvigorate the culture. I mean, one of my friends, he's an incredibly bright biochemist, American, Californian. Both of us were together at Oxford, my neighbor at Oxford, and he always used to say, that the best way to get rundown neighborhoods up and going is for an active mayor to have lots of basketball courts, sports facilities, walk around, engage with the youth, get them to be productive and proactive instead of drifting off into gangs. And at the time, I thought he was being a bit simplistic, but I have greater sympathy, having seen these experiments, having seen the impact of such experiments around the world, that yes, he had a point. Sometimes some of the answers, it's not one key that unlocks all your locks, but that community activity, community engagement, sports, especially for the youth, especially for young men, does make a difference.
There's a lot of data to support that
Yeah.
argument, and I mean it's very clear cut. Problem-oriented policing is one of the few policing strategies that actually works, and that's where in my master's was in criminal justice with
Yes,
a
indeed.
statistical research focus, right?
Yeah.
So I read so many of these studies,
Yeah.
and is where you go into this neighborhood, a bad neighborhood,
Yeah.
you find it, a park that's filled with drug traffickers and people are getting raped and the buildings are collapsing, and you go in there and you bring all the resources of the community together. You clean up the sidewalks, you do the broken windows thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You fix up the neighborhood, you increase lighting. What you'll find is you'll displace a lot of the criminal activity, but every time you displace it, you lessen it as well. So he's absolutely right. So giving people working on the demand side is the primary way you should do this. But we're not just stopping drugs. So when you're talking about narco-terrorism, you're not talking about should we stop the bales of marijuana coming across the Mexican border. Sure, that's important. But you're talking about narco-terrorists. You're talking about people who commit acts of violence. These are terrorist crimes, right? So they're either directly supporting or they are engaging in acts of terrorism or designate terrorist groups themselves. Hijackings, murders, like assassinations. They're going after non-combatants for political means in murdering people. So we're not talking. We're going a little far afield when we talk about just the drugs and should we be stopping the drugs or how do you stop the drugs? It's the violence that's the problem.
Since you talk about violence, let's talk about Mexico and Latin American drug cartels. We've mentioned them, but let's go deeper. They have been beheading people. They have been hanging dead bodies by lampposts or wherever, by bridges. They've been engaging in acts of graphic and gratuitous violence. Um, how have these drug cartels evolved from narcotic smuggling networks into quasi-military and paramilitary forces?
So there is a reason that they're hanging bodies from lampposts, right? They're engaging in political violence. When you politically assassinate somebody or when you leave bodies out for everyone to see, you're sending a message that if you interfere with us, you'll have the same fate. So over recent years, I would say that the Mexican cartels have gone even beyond narco-terrorist groups. They're now insurgent groups. So the very stability of Mexico itself is on a knife's edge, and they're in direct military conflict with Mexican military forces and police forces. Mexico, there's so much corruption there, and the money that's involved with the drugs is what does it, right?
Well, I have a few Mexican friends who are worried that corruption is eating away the vitals of the Mexican state.
Oh, 100%, and it's been doing that for a very long time. I mean, if you don't have the rule of law, if corruption itself, I mean, within the judiciary and the police, you see this in countries around the world where you have to bribe people to get your products exported. Like it just sucks money out of production, and so you're spending double or triple on items because of the money that has to go to make a society work, and that's you see the bureaucracies grow, right? So the corruption itself is a huge problem, but what these groups have done, these cartels have done, and many of them now are designated just in this last year in 2025. A number of them have been designated by the Trump administration as foreign terrorist organizations. Is they've become paramilitary. So they're carrying AR-15s and AK-47s. They have RPGs. They have hand grenades and mines and armored vehicles. They have these makeshift armored vehicles.
We just saw the violence they unleashed in Mexico just recently as evidence of all of that. And so, since you've mentioned the Trump administration more than once, let me ask you what you think of the Mexican administration's strategy to confront Mexican cartels using military force.
I think they have to. I mean, the very, as we talked about what creates a nation state, when you have paramilitary insurgent groups within your borders that are trying to destabilize and control whole regions of your country, if you want to be a country, you have to defeat them.
So, but this means that, does this mean that American troops will be working with Mexican troops across the border?
So we have the Shield of the Americas now, which is a strategy in Central and South America to work with where the American military will work with foreign governments. So it's intelligence sharing, it's sharing of resources, and in some cases it's actually joint military exercises. But it's with the full support and backing of the American military when there's interests that affect the United States and these foreign countries. We're doing it in El Salvador. We're doing it across Central and South America. So yes, you will have military involvement by U.S. military because there's a direct threat to the United States from these various groups.
Isn't this something that should be done by the likes of your old organization, DEA or FBI? Because if the military gets bogged down in counterinsurgency, particularly over a protracted period of time, that dilutes the military ability to, say, take on, heaven forbid, Russia or China in a more conventional military war, or as we are seeing even in Iran, because then it leads to a loss of mission focus and it leads to a dispersion of concentration.
So federal law enforcement, DEA, FBI, customs, like all the elements, right? Department of Homeland Security, all these elements are working, fighting against this war and creating intelligence. But you can't go up against a paramilitary unit with just a bunch of FBI agents, right?
Mm,
And so I was part of a foreign tactical team where
mm,
we went after high value targets. We worked with the SEALs, we worked with
mm.
special forces. In some instances, you need military to give you the weaponry that's necessary and the infrastructure to be able to hit targets in foreign places.
Basically, the force power.
Yeah, you need it. And what we're doing though with this operation is we're letting these foreign governments, and we're supporting them to do it, right? So as opposed to, I mean, there are boots on the ground, obviously, but as opposed to like a full invasion, right, where we're bringing in a huge amount of troops, which would distract us from some of the other
Hmm.
things that the military has to do. We're letting the countries that are most affected do it, and we're giving them support. And so the argument that we have to be ready for China, I agree. Of course we do, right? And so if that means the military needs more funding, then it needs more funding. It doesn't, just because you have one future potential war looming, doesn't mean you shouldn't ignore something right on your border that's happening today. And these do affect the United States. I mean, these cartels are flying armed drones in the United States. This has been happening. It started with surveillance drones, and now you have armed drones, and they're dropping ordnance in Mexico, and it's only a matter of time until it happens here. Like, this is a clear and present danger to the United States, and not to mention all the cartel members that are committing horrific acts of violence in the United States. So you can do both, and we're seeing some success, like in places like El Salvador, where they've taken their country back. And you could argue about some of the methods, and you could argue to the extremes that they go to, but they
Yeah,
had a
there are
country.
certainly allegations of human rights abuses there. There are allegations of concentration of executive power, of the president acting dictatorial, all of that
Yeah, and I have no doubt
exist.
that's true, and they are problems, right?
Mm,
Like you don't want to see that,
mhm.
but also they had a huge problem where the very stability of the country was in question. So I'm not saying you should do those things and we shouldn't, but yes, we have to support them. So we're seeing some progress against the cartels and other narco terrorist groups in
Mm.
Central and South America, and just the stark contrast between now and what was happening under the Biden administration, where people were just coming in unvetted, where we were even detaining people who were on the terrorist watch list and then releasing them into the country, which happened thousands of times. This is really dangerous stuff.
So you fault the Biden administration for losing control of the borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incontrovertible. Like they
Mm.
opened the borders, they flew people over the borders into this country, and then they repopulated them around the country. And we could argue about what are the reasons they did that, whether it was buying votes or whatever the political reasons were. But if you're not vetting people, or even when you're vetting them and then you're still letting them into the country, that's causing a huge problem. And I'm
All
as pro-immigration as anybody you will ever meet.
absolutely.
My wife my grandparents are immigrants, right? I'm very pro-immigration, but you can't let in, say, an MS-13 member. Like, that's just going to cause
Understood.
problems in a community.
Understood. So, what do you say about the argument that the Trump administration is diluting the focus of the military and undermining rule of law in the US itself by the means with which it is fighting this problem?
So domestically, I'd need an example of where they're
Mm,
undermining the rule of law, because what I would consider undermining the rule of law
mm.
is not enforcing the law. So when you're telling your law enforcement to stand down, when you're letting people out of jail who've committed horrific crimes only to commit them again, that undermines the
So
rule of
let
law.
me quote a British politician and commentator, Rory Stewart, who took an objection to the US just sinking boats coming from Venezuela. And he said, look, most drugs don't come from Venezuela. And this is in the name of narco-terrorism or war on drugs. They're sinking boats without due process. And this is a violation of international law. What do you say to Rory's criticism?
I mean, I certainly think there's some merit to it.
Hmm.
I think it's a conversation we should have. I could tell you that I would like to see Congress step up and be more clear in some of the laws.
Hmm.
There are numerous authorities that are cited by the Trump administration for sinking narco terrorist
Hmm.
boats. I can say this idea that we don't know what they are is wrong. Jihad of South tracks these boats. We know where they're coming from. We know the type of boats they
Mhm.
are. And, you see this portrayed in the media sometimes as like recreational vehicles that were these are not. These are drug trafficking boats, and they're coming from terrorist organizations, like people we've designated. So I think if it's not a designated terrorist organization and it's just a drug boat coming in, I think you have a much weaker argument for trying to blow up a boat.
Mhm.
I think also we've been so weak in the enforcement in this area that after we blew up a number of boats, I believe there's like somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 boats they blown up. I think 170-ish people were killed. All of a sudden, they couldn't find targets anymore because the traffic stopped. And remember, these are boats carrying toxic levels of fentanyl into the United States, which were killing, upwards of over 100,000 Americans a year. So it's not like there wasn't a reason to do this. But having said that, I'm a big fan of rule of law, and while there's some 9/11 based law, authorizations for the president, I would like to see Congress step up and actually rule on this. Come up with legislation that talks about this. However, Congress has abdicated their authority decades ago. We've seen, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans in the White House, we've seen people just act through executive action over and over and over again, and I think that's bad for the country.
I mean, the rise of executive privilege and now the theory of unitary executive is converting America into an elected monarchy, not what the founding fathers envisaged. We can read the Constitution, and Article 1 deals with the Congress.
I agree. I agree with that, and I would like to see Congress step up and use the authority that they constitutionally have. I would argue or note that a lot of people who make that very argument about Trump and overstepping didn't say a word when Biden was ignoring laws and acting to impose like a vaccine mandate on 300 million Americans, when he was constantly overstepping, or when Obama was using executive orders to overstep.
So
They
there's
were
a
quiet.
partisan element to these criticisms, and that in itself undermines many of the critics.
Of course, and Trump does many things I disagree with, and I'm pretty vocal about them
Hmm.
because I think you need to be objective and you need to look at things. If you're just wearing a team shirt, and if anything your team does is okay, that's not objective, and that does undermine everything.
Let's go back to narcoterrorism. My final question to you. You've said narcoterrorism has increased, although in recent years it has gone down because of firm action. Um, but let's assume the criminal or the drug trafficking gangs continue to become more powerful. They create vast criminal empires. Will they end up functioning like shadow states?
They do now. I mean,
Mm,
they MS-13 was acting as its own government in
mm,
El Salvador. I mean, absolutely they can do that, and you see it domestically in the United States right now, where you have powerful gangs that work in poor neighborhoods, and they basically run those neighborhoods. You see it in
mm,
Puerto Rico, as I mentioned earlier, and the stronger they get, the worse things get.
mm,
Um, we really have to. We have enough laws on the books. I
mm.
mean, I would argue we have too many laws on the books, but we need to
No, I
enforce.
agree. I agree. I agree. If you have too many laws on the books, and that has happened in many former colonies, then every citizen has to break the law just to get by in daily life. And if you criminalize, in particular, economic activity, which many former colonies have done, then basically you develop a culture of breaking the law, and eventually you have no respect for the law. So I'm a big believer in having certainty when it comes to laws, specificity when it comes to laws, and clarity when it comes to laws. Don't have too many laws, because if you have too many laws, then the law is an ass.
Yes, and people have to understand what the law is to begin with. Like, take the tax code, for example, right?
Yeah,
When you have the head of the IRS hiring their own tax accountants to figure out how to do their taxes, you have a problem, right? It's no
that's
one's read this
correct.
entire code, and it changes all the time. But it goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
We're way overregulated. The economic laws. Most people are committing some kind of crime every day without even knowing about it.
Mm.
That is a huge problem. So I would love to see a reform on that. But conversely, I would, or in looking at the other side of that coin, I would also say we have to start enforcing the laws that do matter more. So when people are committing violence, when people are you've seen this over the last 4 years. You saw this quite a bit, where people were going in and looting stores, and the companies didn't want to do anything because they were afraid of liability, and the police weren't doing anything. You can't have that and have a functioning society. So when one individual is infringing on the rights of another, the state has to come in and act, because, as we've talked about, they have the monopoly on the use of force. So we have to do that. And when somebody commits a violent crime, no matter how much empathy you may have for the life that person has had, they need to be removed from society. And in addition to that problem-oriented policing I mentioned, the only other criminal justice theory that works is incapacitation. So it's taking that person out of society and incarcerating them so they cannot commit more crimes.
I mean, you're ending on the note of incarceration, but America already incarcerates more people than any other first world state. And the prison industrial complex is a big drain on the taxpayer as well. So is incarceration the right way ahead? Because often people get into prison for minor offenses and come out as hardened criminals. So they come out, they go to finishing school. So is that necessarily the right way ahead? Or we need to rethink criminal justice. We have to reform the criminal justice system itself. Because we had a podcast, or rather a conversation about the jury system with somebody in the Cato Institute, your libertarian friends. And he talked about reinvigorating the jury system because the prosecutors now have way too much power in America.
I would argue that we are under incarcerating violent offenders right now, but we are over incarcerating non-violent offenders.
I see.
I would agree with you on that. In that,
I want to see. I'm reflecting the arguments. Yes. I'm listening.
Yeah, no,
I'm not a specialist in this field.
Yeah, no, I would, but I think you're right, and I would reform our laws in that you shouldn't be we overcriminalize too many things. However, the real crime, violent crime, destruction of property, even, which is nonviolent, but it must be stopped. Those kind of crimes, a blatant disregard for the rights of other individuals, has to be protected by law. Because if we don't, that's where you see the rise in vigilantism. That's where you see people stepping up, and that's the disintegration over time of a society. So we have to stop letting violent criminals out of jail, and let's maybe stop imposing all of these other laws and making the laws more understandable for the everyday person.
One quick comment. An Italian friend, Sicilian friend, once said that the reason we have the mafia is because the state cannot deliver what it must. So the mafia steps in, or the Cosa Nostra steps in, and delivers justice that is immediate, protection that the people need, and so on and so forth. And in a way, the extortion is nothing but the tax the mafia is collecting for delivering what the state can't.
So that's a good argument if you have a failing state, and if a state is not delivering the basic roles of government, and at the very basis of government, right? You have an army to protect your borders, and you have police to prevent you from being attacked by your fellow citizens. If you can do those two things, everything else is sort of extra. That's why when we're releasing people who are violent, or we're not in allowing police to be able to do their jobs, which we saw a lot. There was so much anti-police rhetoric in this country after 2016 that police stopped doing proactive policing.
Defund the police.
Yeah, that's a big mistake, right? And if you just watch the news, right, every time there's some horrific murder that's happening around the country, the guy has 27 felony arrests leading up to it. This, by the way, and I've studied the data on this in the past. Career recidivists are responsible for the vast majority of violent crime. It's not that the whole society is violent; it's that you have a very small minority of people who are very violent, whether they're sociopaths, whether they have bad risk assessment, whatever the problem is with them. At some point, and I'm not talking about 3 strikes with a shoplifting offense, but I'm talking about violence. At some point, you just have to remove them from society because there's no other answer. They are not going to reform.
Got it. So be stronger on violent crime and go easy on the smaller ones in terms of not sending them to jail, but make sure they are punished.
Yes.
Exactly. All right. Jeffrey, real pleasure. Great conversation. We'll have you back. Thank you very much for your time.
It was my pleasure. I love these conversations, so thank you for having me.
Thank you. And those of you who've enjoyed listening to this conversation, make sure you follow this podcast on whatever platform you're using. Could be YouTube, could be Spotify, could be Apple Podcasts. And of course, go to our website, subscribe to our newsletter. We publish more than 3,000 authors from over 90 countries. And so for insightful conversations and insights, commentary from interesting guests, keep listening to FO Podcasts. Thank you.